Hey everybody, and welcome back to our lecture series. I'm Ted, your host, and for today's lecture, we are going to conduct an analysis of the Great Depression. Now, before we begin our analysis, our lecture for today, our analysis of the Great Depression, I'd just like to do our customary recap and touch bases on what we discussed in our last lecture. So, in our last lecture, we looked at the analysis of the New Deal. We compared the actions of Herbert Hoover and his presidential successor, Franklin D. Roosevelt. And we examined the multiple aspects of the New Deals. The first New Deal and the second New Deal were two separate legislative and civilian administrative components associated with Roosevelt's plan to uplift the nation out of the Depression. We examined the enduring impact and the legacy of these programs, such as the Social Security Act, which today plays a major role in the affairs of the Republic. The old age pension scheme it's become one of those one of these American institutions that sort of took on a life of his own. So too did the dependent clause in that act, the aid to dependent children, the aid to mothers and dependent children, which became welfare, which became the federal welfare program, which has its defenders and its detractors. Many labeling it the great narcotic that Roosevelt warned about. But aside from that, we examined and we found that the Depression was not really overcome by the programs of the New Deal. That while the New Deal was innovative, it was brash, it was bold, and it truly was designed to help the American population, it didn't do much to really break the panic and the fragility of American society and American economic life during the Great Depression. It was only mass government spending and the mass employment that World War II, the rearmament and preparation and fighting World War II did to rebound the American economy and to sustain it. Now that we've done that, let's dive right into our lecture topic for today. And for our lecture today, we're going to begin immediately with the Depression analysis. Now, throughout the history of the United States, there have been economic depressions and economic panics. In previous lectures, we spoke about the Panic of 1819 that largely helped the really unknown but kind of popular Andrew Jackson ascend to the forefront of American politics and national leadership. We also covered the Panic of 1837 that came about as a result of Jackson's Great Bank War and largely ruined the presidency of Martin Van Buren. We also discussed the Panic of 1873 and 1893 that fueled both the populist and the progressive movements. But one economic panic looms large in the history of the United States, and that is the Great Depression. So the question now becomes, what makes the Great Depression so great? The Panic of 1873 lasted far longer. And it did not end until 1878. The Panic of 1893 lasted until 1896 and was just as severe for its time. Now, the Panic of 1893 had severe unemployment rates and a lasting impact on politics for a generation. The Great Depression was a national travesty, a coalescing of a group of economic downturns. Now, the Great Depression was also one of the worst economic disasters that affected the United States. The Great Depression lasted from 1929 to 1933, and it deeply affected American society. The economy of the United States shrunk by nearly 1/3. Furthermore, the lack of demand brought on inflation and falling price levels. Now, unemployment was under 3.5% in 1929. By 1933, it was at 25%, at 25% of the American working population out of work. The major industrial centers, the unemployment rate was as high as 50%. You're looking at half of all industrial workers being thrown out of work. Now, we do not have complete records on this matter because the records do not count those who are completely falling off the grid. Some people during the time they simply faded away from society. Homelessness soared, with nearly 1 million people being counted as homeless. There was this great shock and a real direct challenge to the American identity coming out of the experiences of World War I and the Roaring Twenties. Now, the United States was touted in Europe as the land of unbelievable opportunity. Now, malnutrition and hunger plagued the majority of that land of opportunity's population. There was no government assistance mechanisms to aid the citizenry at this time. Prior to the Depression, the nation had enjoyed substantial growth and a high birth rate and high immigration rates. During the Depression, the birth rate fell and remained low until the mid 1940s. And as late as 1940, the unemployment rate was still in the mid-teens, topping around 15-14%. Now, the Depression itself was very strange to those who observed and to those who study it. The United States had been booming just a few years before. All of the factories, equipment, workers, finished goods, raw goods, they were still there. All the components that had made the United States such a global titan during the Roaring Twenties were still in place. Nothing had really changed. There had been no great calamity. There wasn't a great sickness. There wasn't natural disasters. None of that. None of that befell the Republic. For many who lived through this time, there was no foreseeable explanation for why everything went wrong. And many were left asking just how could the economy just disintegrate into nothing in such a short amount of time. The Depression is one of the most important economic events in the 20th century, and it continued to generate interest right up to the present. And with our analysis, we're going to look into the Great Depression, and we're going to begin by looking at the general surface reasoning for the Depression. And to begin with, we're going to look at the normal economic cycle. Now, the normal economic cycle for the generation that lived through the Depression, and really for us now, is that it is the cycle of expansion and contraction. People at the time said this happens. Attributed it to the normal cycle. That is, the economy goes up and then it goes down and then it turns itself around. Given that their expertise, that their experience from the 1890s onwards, this was a very reasonable expectation or explanation. Men like Andrew Mellon, Mellon. Were unfazed by the downturn, and they thought that a recession was both beneficial to the nation and a benefit as a method of self-regulation for the capitalist structure. They argued that it purged the rottenness from the system. Another factor in the Great Depression was the stock market crash in 1929. The stock market peaked on September 3rd, 1929, with the Dow Jones averaging 381. And by the 1st of October, it had slid to 320. From there, it crashed all the way down to 230. And by the middle of November 1929, it was below 200. The stock market crash. It again perplexed people at the time. There was booming economic growth at the time. Investors were not overconfident in 1920. It was extremely profitable to invest in the 1920s, though. More importantly, and more to our point, the increase in market activity was tracking along with the dividends at the beginning of the 20s. That the burgeoning automobile and electronic firms, the new automobile companies and the new electronic companies were paying out handsome dividends. There was not a lot of speculation going on up until the middle of 1928. By this time, dividends started to fall, while the market share price continued to rise. This was influenced because the rise of what we discussed in previous lectures, margin buying. It was relatively easy to purchase stocks by buying on margin. That is, by putting only 10 to 20% of the purchase price and borrowing the rest. Also in 1928, many well-known business leaders began to announce that they disagreed with what the market said their stocks were worth. Another factor to consider is that there was a tech bubble. That is, electronics, automotives, and novelty companies. They were attracting great amounts of attention while producing very little in sales. The vast expansion of industry began to pull the ordinary citizen into the market. Until then, the stock market was largely a private club for professionals. Many semi-professional and businessmen made up the ranks of it. But by the mid-20s, the average worker from the assembly lines, construction sites, housewives, and even janitors began to dabble in the market. You had this broad expansion, this sort of democratization of stock investing. Now, the Federal Reserve was also becoming worried about the rate of the economy, the state of the economy, and decided to tighten the flow of money to suppress the amount of speculation then taking place. Now, the Federal Reserve raised interest rates and the economy did slow down. All of these reasons largely fail actually to satisfy the question of why did the market crash. Because explaining a crash is very difficult. It involves personally judging the persons involved in the decision-making process during the crash, whether they were just incredibly pessimistic or overly optimistic, or just a curious mix of both. Now, in our analysis of the Great Depression, we're going to continue looking at the market crash itself. And we do that because many people often ask, since the market crash occurred before the Depression, did the stock market crash in 1929 actually cause the Great Depression? Now, the stock market crash occurred before it, and many people still hold to it that it is the reason that the Depression occurred, but that isn't entirely accurate. There were many more factors at play than just the stock market crash. In 1929, only 6% of households owned stocks. That's 6% of the general population, and really only 500,000 of that 6% held really any stock of substantial value. That is 80% or more of the stocks. And really that all translates to meaning that the stock market crash would have had a very pronounced and negative effect on the very wealthy, but not really would have touched the ordinary worker. Also, market crashes do not cause factories to close or workers to become less knowledgeable, or technologies to become irrelevant. Moreover, there were market crashes in 1907 and 1920 that did not lead to depressions. In 1987, there was, and this is jumping, way into the shadow of contemporary United States affairs. In 1987, there was a stock market crash, and the country did not even go into a recession. So while the market crash of 1929, were followed by a depression, it is not clear that the crash really led to the depression. So now we're forced in our analysis to ask, if the stock market crash of 1929 did not lead to the Great Depression, what other factors could have led to the depression? Now, one reason for the economy to go into decline the way it did is if there was a decline in the aggregate demand or buying power. That is, this decline can be caused by business investments receding, consumption falls, government demand falls, export demand shrinks, and really the situation by 1932, because of those factors, was that business investment had fallen to 1% of the GDP. An investment rate that low cannot keep up with the demand to replace worn-out machinery. But investments had peaked in the 1920s with the housing boom. So it cannot be conclusively identified as the culprit behind the Depression. It certainly did not help things, but it also really didn't cause the Depression, the economic situation. Consumption is the next big sort of drawn point that people look to. Many people point out then and now that the American public was just completely oversaturated with products. They had the new houses, they had the new cars, they had the vacuum, the washers, the radios, all of the creature comforts that we all come to know, love, and take for granted. They had all those things. It is a theory, but not a well-grounded one. That public demand for these products never really falls to the point where a great economic fall off and a great fall off in production induces a Great Depression. Even though people have those things, they still want more things. It's like a family with only one driver will still have two cars instead of one. A family would have more than one television. They'd have a television in every room. Moreover, they would have portable viewing devices. They would have a radio at home, and they'd have also a radio that they took with them. They would have all these sort of little creature devices, all these sort of little creature comforts. And with that, we'll break here. We'll break on this part one of our analysis, and we'll come back with part two of our analysis of the Great Depression. And as always, I'm Ted. Hit like, subscribe, and comment, and let me know what you thought about this lecture.